Do you ever wish you could just press pause on your problems? You know, really make those worries of yours fall to the wayside for a few moments? Well, did you know that you're not alone? For thousands of years, humans have been searching for ways to escape from their problems and enter worlds where they don't have to worry about anything. Some people find solace in daydreams. Others escape into the pages of a fantasy novel or watch movies that transport them to other times and places. But perhaps the most popular form of escapism is sleep. Now we know you'd never admit to this, but let's be honest, sometimes we'd all rather be sleeping than doing whatever it is we're supposed to be doing. That's why we've created this series, Boring History for Sleep. Every week or two we'll take you to simpler times when the greatest threat you'll face is getting a paper cut and the biggest decision you'll make is whether or not to wear socks with your sandals. We do the research so you don't have to. All you have to do is listen and drift off to dreamland. Who knows what historical nooks and crannies your mind will explore while you're embracing the peaceful slumber. And now, without any further ado, here's our first installment of Boring History for Sleep, the harsh truth of life in ancient Rome. Have you ever dreamed of being a Roman emperor? You live in a time when gladiators fight to the death for your amusement and an army of slaves cater to your every whim. Chariots clog up the streets of the greatest city in the world as merchants hawk their wares and the Colosseum roars with the screams of men and beasts. You sip wine from a golden goblet, fine linen draped over your legs, and plan your conquest of Gaul. It's easy to imagine the opulence of ancient Rome and think that life during the Pax Romana must have been amazing. However, beneath the surface of the Eternal City lurked filth, danger, and despair. Ancient Rome was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, and at its peak it housed somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. For context, modern-day Rome only has about 2.8 million residents. At its height then, ancient Rome was nearly as densely populated as modern-day New York. And if you've ever been to New York, you know how crowded it can get. Emperor Augustus established the city's first formal zoning laws, which divided the city into 14 regions and numbered them in the traditional Roman fashion. I, two, thirds, etc. You know, when we talk about numbering things romantically, this is what we mean. To make matters easier, these regions were further divided into 160 neighborhoods called vici. But no matter how advanced their zoning laws were, Rome was still a chaotic jumble of insulae, business and residential districts, temples, government buildings, markets and roads. The majority of the city's inhabitants lived in the insulae, many of which were little more than glorified apartment complexes. Rome was largely built on a swamp, so the ground level was below sea level. This meant that it was common for the insulae to have flooded basements. There was also very little sanitation in Rome. Residents would often use the Tiber River water for drinking, cooking and cleaning. So if the river flooded, they would be inundated with sewage and other debris. Flooding was a common problem in ancient Rome. Even though the Romans built impressive aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city, they didn't have a good system for draining it. When it rained, the streets would quickly turn into rivers. And in extreme cases, residents would have to flee their homes and abandon their possessions as the floodwaters rose. The narrow, winding streets of Rome were mostly unpaved and covered in a thick layer of mud. During the summer months, the heat would build up in the insulae, and since most of them didn't have windows, it would become almost unbearable inside. To make matters worse, because of the lack of proper plumbing, toilets would often overflow and the stench of stale urine and excrement would permeate through the buildings. If you made it past the insula, you might find yourself in the business district of Rome. Here vendors hawked their wares to the crowds of shoppers. The Forum Magnum, or simply the Forum, was the center of public life in ancient Rome. Here senators conducted business, citizens debated politics, and criminals were put on trial. But because the Forum was always so crowded, it was a prime spot for pickpockets and con artists. Also, the closer you got to the center of the Forum, the more likely you were to be dragged into a political debate, whether you wanted to be there or not. The Forum was also home to a number of government buildings, including the Senate House and the Basilica, where courts were held. These buildings were usually constructed of stone and were some of the most impressive structures in Rome. However, since the government officials often abused their power, it was best to steer clear of these buildings if you didn't want to get on their bad side. Further down the road, you might see the massive Colosseum, which was the site of Rome's famous gladiator games. The Colosseum was also used for mock sea battles and animal hunts. But because these events were so bloody and violent, it was probably best to keep your distance. There was one place in ancient Rome where you definitely didn't want to go, and that was the Subura. This was the city's red light district, where prostitutes and other sex workers plied their trade. It was also home to a number of taverns and gambling dens. If you couldn't afford to pay for a prostitute, you might find yourself accosted by one who was looking for business. And if you refused her advances, she might just blackmail you later. Although ancient Rome is often depicted as a dirty and dangerous place in modern media, it's important to remember that this was a common misconception of the time. People living outside of Italy rarely had any contact with the common folk of Rome. Most of what they knew about the city came from merchants, soldiers, and politicians who had business in the city. Naturally, they didn't hang out in the same places as the average Roman citizen, so they didn't see the worst of what Rome had to offer. Instead, they saw the magnificent monuments and talked to the well-to-do Romans who frequented the taverns and gambling halls. As a result, many people believed that ancient Rome was a city of luxury and decadence. Today, we know that this was far from the truth. Much of what we know about the daily lives of ordinary Romans comes from the writings of Pliny the Younger, a Roman senator and natural philosopher. He described the streets of Rome as filthy and full of rubbish. He said that the crowds were so thick in the forum that it was difficult to move around. And he claimed that the stench of urine and excrement was so bad that it was impossible to breathe. But it wasn't all bad news. Pliny also wrote about the beauty of ancient Rome. He said that the city was full of magnificent buildings and statues, and he praised the Romans for their love of art and culture. He also wrote about the great aqueducts and public baths that supplied the city with clean water and the abundance of food that could be found in the markets. So what was life like in ancient Rome? Well, it depended on where you lived and what you did for a living. If you were a wealthy senator, you probably lived in one of the luxurious villas on the Palatine Hill and spent your days conducting business in the Forum. If you were a middle-class merchant or craftsman, you probably lived in one of the insulae and spent your days selling your wares in the marketplace. And if you were a poor laborer or slave, you probably lived in one of the slums and spent your days working for pennies. No matter who you were, you could be sure of one thing: life in ancient Rome was never boring. We hope you enjoyed today's installment of Boring History for Sleep. Now it's time for bed. Don't stay up too late watching videos. Be sure to wake up early tomorrow so you can start your day right. Oh, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button before you go.